Hi everyone, this is Mr. Zirkle, and this video is an introduction to ecosystems. We'll be talking about where ecosystems fall in the grand scheme of things and some of the interactions that take place within them. The natural world, which is what we'll be focusing on in the next few sections, can be organized into several different levels. These levels begin at the singular level with an organism and increase in size and scope as we move up through the biosphere. We'll briefly go through each level and we'll talk about them so that you can have an understanding of where ecosystems fall within these levels of organization. The first level that we want to talk about is the organism. It's an individual living being, like this zebra. It could very well be a plant, though. It could be a bacteria, it could be a fungus, really anything that's living. The next level of organization is a population. A population is a group of individuals of the same species that are living together, and that's important that it's the same species. This could be a herd of zebras, could be a herd of elephants, a colony of bacteria, or even a city that's filled with people. The next level of organization is a community, and a community is comprised of different species living in the same location. In this picture of the Serengeti, you can see herds of elephants, zebras, and wildebeests. It's important to realize, though, that we're not just talking about animals here. When we talk about a community, we're talking about all living things. For instance, in this picture of the savanna, the community also includes the grasses, the trees, the shrubs, as well as the animals, the zebras and the elephants, etc. It's an important distinction to make because students often confuse communities with ecosystems, and ecosystems include living and non-living components. So when we talk about a community, we're only talking about the living components. Next up, we have the ecosystem. As we just mentioned, an ecosystem is comprised of living and non-living components and their interactions. For instance, in this picture, not only are we talking about the plants and animals, we're also talking about the weather conditions, the soil types, the rocks, the water, anything that is non-living as well as living in the ecosystem. These two components interact with each other, and we'll go into more detail about that a little bit later. Next up, we have a biome. A biome is a group of ecosystems that have a similar climate and a similar dominant communities. This map of the world shows different biomes of the world. You can see that savannas, which are shown in yellow, um, and which are a type of tropical grassland, can be found on several different continents, including Africa, Australia, and South America. These biomes can shift based on long-term climate conditions. For example, during the Ice Age, some of these biomes may have shifted south as ice covered much of the northern hemisphere. Finally, we have the biosphere. Now, the biosphere is any location on Earth where life is found, and that includes the air, the water, and the land. All of these parts of the biosphere work together as a system, so any change that we make to one has a great consequence to the other parts, and that's something that we'll want to keep in mind as we move forward. From here on, we'll be speaking about ecosystems. And as we've mentioned, ecosystems are comprised of two components, biotic and abiotic components. These components of an ecosystem interact, and one can affect the other and vice versa. Biotic components are those things that are living, such as plants, animals, and fungi, and abiotic components, on the other hand, are those things that are non-living, such as weather, rocks, pH, and sunlight. In an ecosystem, relationships between living things can be complex. So ecologists have identified 5 basic types of interactions among species as they share the limited resources such as food, shelter, and space in an ecosystem. For example, in a savanna, water may be limited and confined to shallow pools, and this causes these species to interact in many different ways. So the first of these 5 ways is competition. Competition is the most common interaction in an ecosystem, and there are actually 2 types of competition. interspecific competition and intraspecific competition. The first type, interspecific competition, occurs between members of different species. For instance, in this picture, you can see a female lion competing for food with hyenas. The lion has either really had her fill, or more than likely, she's been run off by the hyenas. Note that the prefix inter means between. The second type of competition is intraspecific competition. And intraspecific competition occurs between members of the same species. It happens often when members of a species defend their territory or breeding privileges. Um, Note that the prefix intra means among. Now, if niches overlap too much, one of those species must either move to another area or suffer a decline in population. The greater the overlap, the more they compete for resources. So, for example, if species A takes over a larger share of a key resource and species B um, doesn't get as much of that resource, they're going to have to either move to a new location or, as I said before, suffer a population decline. Given enough time, say a number of generations, the species could also develop adaptations that enable them to coexist with other species. One example of this is resource partitioning, which provides equal access to a resource while using that resource in a different way or at different times. Take, for example, these 5 species of warblers. Warblers eat insects in the spruce forests of Maine, and in order to share the wealth, so to speak, these birds have developed adaptations that allow them to feed in different parts of the spruce tree. For instance, the myrtle warbler hunts insects in the lower branches, and the Cape May warbler hunts in the upper branches of the spruce tree. Okay, so we've talked about interspecific and intraspecific competition. The third type of interaction is predation, which is exactly what you might think it is. It's the predator-prey relationship where one species feeds on another. We usually think of rabbits as the prey for animals such as hawks and foxes, and they are considered prey in those instances. However, rabbits eat plants, and in that relationship, rabbits are considered the predator and the plants the prey. All right, so we want to talk about symbiotic relationships, and symbiotic relationships are close, long-term relationships between two species. There are 3 types of symbiotic relationships. There's parasitism, there's mutualism, and there's commensalism. All right. So first, we want to take a look at parasitism. And parasitism occurs when one species benefits at the expense of another. For instance, you can see here the sea lamprey, which is an invasive species in the Great Lakes, is attached to this lake trout. And in this case, it's feeding off of that lake trout. And a tick is another common example of a parasite that feeds off of a host. It feeds off of numerous different types of animals and feeds off its blood. Now, one thing to make note of is that parasites usually do not kill the host. Parasites will often feed on the host, so it doesn't benefit them to kill the host. Um, the second type of symbiotic relationship we want to talk about is mutualism. Mutualism occurs when both species benefit. Um, Take for instance this oxpecker. The oxpecker feeds on ticks that infest the zebra, and they also warn of approaching predators. Another example would be the clownfish and the sea anemone. The clownfish are immune to the stinging tentacles of the anemone, and they can find shelter there. And they also feed on the waste that's left over from the anemone's meals. On the other hand, the sea anemone benefits because the clownfish protects them from certain parasites. So it's a win-win situation for both of these species. Finally, we want to take a look at commensalism. Commensalism occurs when one species benefits and the other isn't affected. For example, you can see this fish here, this remora, and it hitches a ride on sharks. And you also have pitcher plants that are a type of carnivorous plant that attaches themselves to trees and they feed on insects in the rainforest. They don't harm the trees in any way, so the pitcher plant benefits. On the other hand, the tree, isn't affected. All right, so just to review, there are five types of relationships within an ecosystem. There's competition, which include intra and interspecific competition. There's predation, there's parasitism, there's mutualism, and then there's commensalism. All right, well, that's the end of this video. We'll talk a little bit more about these concepts in class tomorrow. So have a good day.